which is what we're going to talk about is how to handle challenging texts in the Old Testament, specifically within 2 Kings. We're going to take a look at that because when you go to atheist websites, one of the things you'll notice right away is these attacks on the Old Testament, usually on the judgment texts that are going down. And they'll say, hey, what's up? Is this your God? In fact, this is the way this story we're going to talk about today came first to be in my radar, if you will. I used to go out on Mill Avenue in Tempe and witness to the ASU students out there when they were partying and all of that. And there were a lot of street preachers, and generally speaking, their methods and theology and personalities and attitudes were, they left a lot to be desired, I'll just put it that way. And so what happened is, though, these street preachers were out there, and there was these atheists, kind of evangelists, although they don't really have good news. And they were this group called the Mill Avenue Resistance. And they had a website and everything called betterthanfaith.com. And they even had tracts. Yes, they had tracts. Atheist, kind of actually anti-evangelist tracts. And one of the first ones I saw that caught my attention was titled, "Is This Your God?" Big bold letters, big question mark. They would hand it out, had a picture of a roaring bear. Luke Pearson of Apologia Radio might have liked this track. And it had a giant bear, and then it had a Bible text. And what we're going to do is read this text, and then we're going to discuss it. Myself and Jeff Durbin, and my main man right over here, Robert Bender, is going to be the one who's going to read the text. He's in the studio today just to take some pictures, do some social media stuff. And I said, hey, Robert, why don't you jump on here and read the Bible, man? He said, well, I'm kind of nervous. But you could do it, man. So this is 2 Kings chapter 2, verses 23 and 24. Robert Bender with the text.
He went up from there to Bethel, and while he was going up on the way, some small boys came out of the city and jeered at him, saying, "Go up, you bald head, go up, you bald head." And he turned around and he saw them, and he cursed them in the name of the Lord. And 2 she-bears came out of the woods and tore 42 of the boys. From there he went on to Mount Carmel, and from there he returned to Samaria.
All right, thank you very much. So I'm going to read actually from this atheistic tract, because this is kind of exemplary of some of the other things you'll see. For example, the Infidel Guy, if you know that radio show, he talked about this. This is commonly cited. And here's what it says. In this passage, a group of children teased the bald prophet Elisha. If he were the prophet of a king, and if he were the prophet of a kind and loving God, he would turn the other cheek. But instead, he curses them, and his God sends bears to kill 42 of the kids. This is a fine example of the cruelty and pettiness so often shown by the God of the Bible. Most Christians believe in a God of love and forgiveness, but the Bible's God is a God of fear and vengeance. Do you think this monster is worthy of praise? Do you think it even exists? Do you believe in a God that sends bears to massacre children? betterthanfaith.com. Never stop thinking. All right, so Jeff Durbin stepped in the studio. You've heard the problem laid out. I've given you some resources there. That's that book called Dealing with Difficult Bible Text. Oh, hard passages
sayings of the Bible, yeah.
Yeah, pretty good. The little entry there, actually, that they've done is really good. So check that out. I've got another one on hand called God Behaving Badly. Is the God of the Old Testament angry, sexist, and racist.
Yeah.
And we want to talk about this passage in specific, maybe as a paradigm of how to deal with these types of passages in general. So I have some stuff I want to say. Jeff, do you want to give first thoughts, or do you want me to lead it off?
I mean, just to start, if this is a challenge coming from an atheist. By the way, I saw that track, dude.
Really?
I've been handed that track before.
It gets around.
It does get around on Mill Avenue for the atheist proselytizers.
Yeah. So before we do the answering, you want to do some first steps first. What's the first step you take when you read a track like this?
The first step?
Yeah.
Well, in a case like this, try to be respectful as I begin to answer them.
Well, because you said coming from an atheist, so I imagine you're going somewhere.
Well, yeah. I mean, so I got this track from Atheist, and it's interesting because I think the first thing you have to do when you look at it is not allow the emotional things that come up in a Christian's mind to override sort of like your responsibility and the logical inconsistency in the encounter. So what I mean by that is you have an atheist challenging a Christian about the moral actions of God, but atheists grant that there's no immanent morality. Atheists grant that there is no good, there is no evil, only blind and pitiless indifference. So the person bringing the challenge to you has to essentially ride on your worldview in order to bring the challenge.
Because within their worldview, bears eat kids, even though that's not really what happened, but bears eat kids, poop them out, so what?
Right. Well, I mean, animals...
Just a transfer of matter and energy.
That's
so
right.
what?
Animals eat each other all the time. And you
Yeah.
don't see atheists sitting up in arms complaining and having moral indignance over the animal that goes and pounces on the gazelle and, chews it up. You might think it's disgusting. It might be a bit horrific to watch.
You might hope it doesn't happen to you.
Yeah, exactly. But the problem is that from the atheistic perspective, we're all just simply matter in this purposeless cosmos. And what animals do to one another, animals do all kinds of things to each other, like copulate with one another without asking for permission. They use the bathroom outside without private places to do it.
They don't even wear clothes.
That's right. I mean,
even Chewbacca does not wear pants.
That's right.
He has a man purse, but no
Yes.
pants.
He does have a man purse. That's funny you pointed it out.
But the reason why this might feel like it has force against the Christian, so we want to let the challenge have its weight, if you want to put it that way, is because they're judging this action against the character and nature of God. And so that's where we say, okay, first, here's what you've got going on. Now let's jump over here and see what we've got going on, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And let me just point out a couple things. We're going to talk about the details, but first of all, the track misrepresents what's going on. It says his God sends bears to kill 42 of the kids.
Mm-hmm.
And it says in another place, massacre children. If you notice in the text, it says the she-bear mauled 42 of them.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't actually say killed them. Now, I'm saying God could do what he wants. So I'm not saying it makes it better or worse necessarily. I'm just saying get your facts straight when you type the English language on the track to prove your point.
Right.
It says mauled 42 of them. It doesn't actually say they died. I don't know. I mean, maybe not. But it seems like a few bears. It seems like they couldn't kill that many that quickly. I don't know. Maybe God gave them the Super Mario star and they were like doing it real fat. Maybe. But I mean, so there's that. And then you've got other things going on that just show you, okay, specifically the use of kids. That's another thing that we want to draw a challenge on.
Yeah.
But what do you want to say in relation to this text specifically, maybe?
Well, I know. You're obviously going to dig into the text to deal with those things, but I would say that the very first thing that I want to do in talking to the atheist is say, listen, I get to care about image bearers of God dying. I still get to struggle as a Christian. There's still I have to confess there still is an internal struggle emotionally about people being mauled by a bear because they mock a prophet. There still is, because those are image bearers of God. And regardless of their hostility towards God and God's prophet and all the rest, it doesn't make a difference when it comes to the emotional issue of image bearers of God and God's good creation dying and who are mocking a prophet. And all those. I get to have all of those complaints, and I get to have that internal struggle. I get to struggle with suffering in the world. I get to struggle with death, even the death of the wicked. I get to have an emotional struggle with that. But see, the atheist doesn't get to have that. The atheist must be consistent. Now, here's the thing, Vocab. I honestly believe, I think it's just my personality that God gave to me. If I were an atheist, I think I would do my best to try to be consistent with it. I think I would. I would try to be as firm on those commitments as an atheist as possible. And so if I was an atheist, I would want to maintain consistency with my atheist position. Like, for example, I think, though I would probably dislike Christianity, I wouldn't have the kind of complaints and zeal to hand out tracts like this one, because I think I would grant that it doesn't really matter. I mean, there is no real moral complaint against the God of the Bible. I think not all atheists want to be consistent, and I think it's because they're image bearers of God. They know they can't in God's world. But you have to push the atheist to consistency when he challenges you on these texts. As a Christian, you get to be emotionally concerned and wrapped up over these things because you believe in God's word. You're standing on his word as the rock. Those are image bearers of God, no matter what. And to die is still a sad thing, no matter what.
Yeah.
When Pharaoh is crushed by God, though God, Romans 9, raises him up for this purpose to display his power in him, guess what? As a Christian, I can still say, oh man, that sucks. That's awful. Like, what an awful thing. Like, it's a sin-cursed, fallen world. And I get to complain about that in a sense emotionally, saying, man, that's still an awful thing. But God, the judge of all the earth, will always do right. And God's purposes are always for good and his glory. And no one will ever complain against him in the last day and say that was unjust or that was wrong. But the thing is this, the atheist brings this challenge. My answer is very simple. So what? So what? I mean, a bear mauled a bunch of young people. So what? It happens all the time. It's happening right now as you bring this complaint. Somewhere in the world, an animal is attacking another animal and no one's really shedding a tear over it. It's gross. It really is gross. But no one really cares. It's just it's a circle of life.
Circle of life. He's getting all Lion King on us.
All
right. Well, let's look at this. I want to bring out a few things. There's a few Hebrew words here. Yeled, for example, used in chapter 2, verse 24. And it can mean boy, young boy, adolescent, older teenager. All you got to do is look at these words up in the lexicon and see the Hebrew word. Some of the translations that say things like little children, I think, are actually unfortunate because it doesn't have to do with the size or stature. It has to do more with the age. So young is probably a better word to use. And in fact, if you read Genesis 44:20, the same Hebrew word is used there for Joseph's brother Benjamin when he was in his 20s. And so you have a situation to understand it's highly unlikely. These are like nursery school, elementary school children hanging out by themselves in the wilderness, first of all. Like unsupervised. What is
this? You bald head!
Desert daycare.
Yeah.
And then they're
just
saying
chilling.
stuff. Yeah, they're saying stuff. And we might say, wow, but all they did is call him bald head. Well, let's look at the full context. What had happened right before this? Elisha's mentor, had been transcended, had went up to heaven in a chariot of fire. And so right after this event, Elisha, who's a young man himself, because his ministry would go on for like another 50 years, so he might be 25 himself, though. So this group that was probably actually kind of close to him in age, and there's more than 42 of them because it says mauled 42 of them. That means there could have been a grip of dudes who see him and they're mocking God ultimately, because what they're saying is, why don't you get up out of here too? Or why don't you leave too? Why don't you die and go away too? If that really happened, is kind of the underlying idea. And plus that, you're prematurely balding, which is a total just diss, especially in the ancient Near Eastern culture that they're in. And so they're mocking God, his actions in history, his prophet before him, and this prophet who was really God's mouthpiece. And remember, this is no small deal because during this time, the kings of Israel were wicked and were wiping out the prophets. There were many, many, many more wicked prophets of Baal and Asherah and all these other ones than there were God's prophets. There was only a small remnant. And so this is really ultimately, at the very least, saying things against God and who he is and his character, and really against God's instrument of judgment and mercy in this situation, who is Elisha. And in a way that God doesn't always have to put up with. God puts up with saying a lot of nonsense about him, but here's an example where he does not. And when we think about the overall ministry of Elisha, he interacts with widows and helps them not have to sell their children into slave debts. He fixes water supplies. He fixes stew so people don't get sick and die. He's someone who has a ministry that is gentle and compassionate and is there for the unnamed widows of the day. But in this story, to make sure he would be able to still have a ministry, I believe God not only preserves his life, but even if there wasn't an immediate threat of danger, God is allowed to do this as a judge of all the earth and enact this upon them. And ultimately, it's really fulfillment of something written in Leviticus. And I'm going to read that in a second. I'm going to pick up a book. But Jeff, commentary on that aspect of it.
Well, yeah, I mean, looking at this little commentary here, Isaiah 3:17 and verse 24, the word bald head, in English, was a term of scorn in the Old Testament. This is the book we're doing, Hard Sayings of the Bible. Natural baldness was very rare in the ancient Near East. So scarce was baldness that it carried with it a suspicion of leprosy. So, we don't really get the force of this in the sense of what the context of it was then. But again, I think that, all those things you brought up are important. Looking at the Old Testament usage of this word, Joseph's context, that word being used of somebody who's a grown man. We think about the context of the prophet coming into the culture, calling people to repentance, calling people to come to God. Listen, God in the Bible has the right through in his decrees to bring about his judgment, his justice, his discipline whenever he pleases. And I think that's kind of
that's the real problem people have. That's the real problem. That's what I think.
Yeah, that's the issue, is that we do have a culture where atheists do get from the Christians the meek and mild Jesus, the Jesus who's the surfer hippie that's really nice, just wants to be your buddy and in your heart. Whereas really the God of the Bible is not just a God of love, mercy, goodness, grace, and truth. He's also a God of justice, and he's a consuming fire. And we have to recognize that all of us, every breath is a gift from God. Every heartbeat is given by God's hand. So we got to grant this. God, in his providence, is perfectly allowed as the just God of all the earth to bring about his works of justice and discipline upon his creation whenever he pleases. Every moment in these youths' lives was a gift from God's hand. And so at that moment, it was God's prerogative as judge of all the earth to bring about in his work of providence through this animal, this creature, his justice and ultimately discipline upon these men or young men. So I think that needs to be kept into context.
And this is a foretaste of the larger judgment that all of us outside of God's mercy face. So that if you're not in Christ, we face the same type of not just temporary, bears, but permanent judgment as we will receive God's wrath unless we hide ourselves in Jesus. But I think the curse, if I had to guess, that Elisha said to these boys was probably just Leviticus 26:21-22. If you remain hostile toward me and refuse to listen to me, I will send wild animals against you, and they will rob you of your children.
Yep.
So ultimately, this is actually
Sanction.
a fulfillment of a prophecy in a way. It's something God had promised he would do. This is the way he would judge Israel. Yeah, Leviticus 26:21-22.
That's a sanction.
Yeah. And so there we go. So the real problem is not the age of the people, I think, when people bring this up. It's the fact we have a God who judges. And indeed we do. Thank you, Jeff Durbin, for joining us. I think you're going to stick around, and we're going to do a show next week together, too. Great.